Hi, everybody. This is episode 30 of the Rule Your Pool podcast. With me today is Joe Swayze, our VP of Sales. Joe, thank you.
Hey, love being here, Eric. Hey, everybody.
We just spent a week at home base in Texas, even though neither you or I live there, but we did not get to record a podcast last week, and that's because the microphones they had just apparently were not compatible with the laptops we had. I don't know why, but we tried, and we're going to do an episode this week, and it's really a timely topic that we want to talk about today, and that is how to optimize your chlorine efficiency, how to get the most out of it, how do we extend the life of it, because we're in a chlorine shortage, and the next episode is going to be about the consequent acid shortage because of the chlorine shortage. So any comments before we get into it?
No, it's timely because it's not getting any better anytime soon. So, let's get into it.
That's right. Episode 30, Rule Your Pool podcast. Let's go. Welcome to Rule Your Pool, the podcast by Orenda that explains and simplifies pool chemistry so that anybody, regardless of experience, can understand it. I'm your host, Eric Knight, bringing clarity to these subjects so that you can bring clarity to your water. If you're ready to rule your pool, then let's go. Okay, Joe, you've been doing this a long time. Have you ever seen a chlorine shortage like this?
I've never seen a shortage of any real critical chemical ever. So when we talk about chlorine or acid or any of those, it's pretty unprecedented times.
Yeah, I mean, just the other day, we were on our group chat in our Orenda text message thread, I guess, and there was that story about somebody, and by the way, if you listen to this podcast, sorry, somebody loaded up their U-Haul with a whole bunch of chlorine from Costco, and it blew the truck up and it was on fire, and they had to evacuate all of Costco because of it. What were your thoughts on that? Is that like a sign of desperation, or what are we seeing here?
Yeah, definitely. People probably driving around from store to store, loading up as much as they can in hopes of avoiding some of this mess. But you get too much of the wrong stuff or just get too much humidity in some cases, and there you go.
Yeah. Well, we also saw in Houston a very scary story of a chemical leak. We're not exactly sure what happened on that, so we're not qualified to talk about it yet, but it involved chlorine. We hear it involves sulfuric acid, but mixing chemicals, not something to be trifled with, and especially precious chemicals that are in short supply right now. So we hope those people are safe. If you are hearing this now and you were one of those operators, if you have questions as to what happened, feel free to reach out to us. But you probably don't listen to this show anyway because, maybe it's just us, Joe. I don't even know.
It's probably just the two of us. Maybe three. I don't know.
We don't even have an audience. We're just doing this for our health. Okay, so let's talk about this chlorine shortage. And primarily, I want to talk about how do we make use or best use of the limited chlorine that we have. In the next episode, 31, we're going to talk more about acid alternatives, but let's focus on chlorine now. The trichlor shortage has forced us to buy other types of chlorine. Now, we saw this coming. We saw this coming as soon as the trichlor factory blew up in August of last year. So this is no surprise to Orenda, but it may be a surprise to the homeowners or the service trade that's listening to this thinking, well, I knew trichlor was going to be in short supply, but I never imagined cal hypo and liquid chlorine would be in short supply. So you know this industry better than I do, Joe. Elaborate. What do you think happened here?
Well, there's a little bit of a double-edged sword here because trichlor is difficult to get, and it's become the chemical that so many people rely on. And it's really hard for them to run their maintenance, their program, their system when they don't have that trichlor. So they're going out and getting it and hoarding it, and that puts the pressure on everybody else. And unfortunately, the situation is, if you've got the room and capacity to store a bunch of that chlorine, you can do that, and a lot of people just don't, and it's a real consideration for storage, etc. So that leaves the alternatives, liquid chlorine, cal hypo, and because that now became the preferred chlorine for a lot of these guys, a run on that occurred too. So then they weren't prepared, and unfortunately now there's a shortage of chlorine in general. It doesn't really matter what chlorine we're talking about, and the price pressure that goes along with that. So
Right. Well, we also have to remember that liquid chlorine is made with elemental gas chlorine, and there's a shortage of that because that same chlorine is needed for all hypochlorite products, and it's needed in cleaning products around our house, which are still in high demand. So all of this is to say these chlorine manufacturing plants were already in high gear. And then you compound that with a trichlor shortage and an everything else shortage and a hot summer and people, there's a lot more pools now. The pools have reopened commercially. There's pools, we're getting phone calls, commercial pools that they can't get chlorine. They're having to shut down because they cannot keep their water safe. And so that's why we're doing this episode. In some cases, you may not be able to get enough chlorine, and that's just the reality of it. But we want to make sure that the chlorine that you do have goes as long as possible. And so we're going to give you a few tips on how to chlorinate a little bit more effectively and how to supplement chlorine. So one of the first things I want to say is cyanuric acid. We talk about it a lot at Orenda. I thought, incorrectly, by the way, I was corrected today on the phone. I thought that the chemistry involving cyanuric acid, it took a while for chlorine to bind to CYA. And it was my impression that that occurred because, all chemistries take a certain amount of time and they're usually temperature dependent. So the hotter the water, the faster a reaction. I think of something like chelation or sequestering metals. It's not exactly a fast process. Well, as it turns out, the binding of chlorine to cyanuric acid is almost instantaneous. Unless the water's really, really cold, in which case it's still really fast. It's just not instantaneous. So if you were to, say, shock a pool, Joe, and you're pouring a liquid chlorine gallon into the water, it is going to bind to CYA faster than it can kill something, even on contact. Isn't that crazy?
That's a little bit crazy.
Now, if you're pouring in one place, there's going to be a lot more liquid chlorine in that one place than the CYA in the entire pool. So obviously you're going to get some that's not protected, but very quickly it's going to be bound up to CYA. So what really matters here is the free chlorine to cyanuric acid ratio once again. So when we're putting it in, the key is you want to chlorinate at a time or in a position that you're not losing chlorine to sunlight. And in particular, liquid chlorine, when you pour it into a pool, if direct sunlight hits it before it even hits the water, just in that fraction of a second, you can actually deteriorate a lot of chlorine. I was pretty surprised by this too. You don't think about that. Oh, I'm just pouring it in. Well, if the sun is in front of you, walk to the other side of the pool, put that chlorine in the shade, block the sun with your body. Or better yet, that's advice for a service pro. But if you're a homeowner, chlorinate at night. Once the sun goes down, give it all night to work. You don't want to lose any of this. This is a very precious commodity now. And so when you want to chlorinate, you want to make sure that you're not losing any of it to direct sunlight. Anything you want to add to that, Joe?
No, I'd say it's a similar consideration for storage. If you've got your chlorine outside in a hot place exposed to the sun, it's deteriorating quickly. So, those gallons, even the opaque white gallons or whatever the container is, right, it's going to let some sunlight in. So, store those in a cool, dry place as much as you can, and that will extend the life of your chlorine as well. So
right, a well-ventilated, cool, dry place, I should say.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And away from other chemicals as well. So
right. And liquid chlorine breaks down over time. It I don't want to say deteriorates, but its effectiveness breaks down just based on how it is. So you want it to be fresh. You want to use it pretty quickly. I just heard this great podcast episode. I forget who hosted it, but it was the CEO of HASA explaining the liquid chlorine shortage, and it was really insightful. I did not know the process of making liquid chlorine. And what he was saying is you want that chlorine to be fresh because when you get it, it could be around 13% or 12.5%. But over time on the shelf, it's breaking down and it might be closer to 10% or even 9% by the time you get it. And it slows down, I'm going to guess at a mathematical rate, it slows down a lot as it gets lower, but that's not the point. The point is, if you are trying to chlorinate effectively, you don't want to hoard something like liquid chlorine all at once and then, store it for months. You want to buy what you need and be fair to those around you. You have neighbors who need it too. If you're in the service trade, there are other people in the business that need chlorine, and everybody hurts when pools start getting shut down, and we have to keep that in mind. So hoarding it and it's like the toilet paper at the beginning of COVID, right? It's not like COVID was dysentery, but yet everybody went out and bought toilet paper. I didn't. I was like, realistically, do we really need that much toilet paper right now? Everybody panic buys things, and that's not a good thing, especially with chlorine. You want to have what you need, and try to be fair to those around you. And I think what goes around comes around in some degree. And you got to keep in mind, it's not like chlorine's not being produced. It is. It's being produced in record numbers. The problem is it's maxed out and the demand is higher than what they can produce right now. And it stems back, it's a ripple effect of the entire supply chain, Joe. It's going all the way up to raw materials like elemental chlorine. So there's only so much you can do. Try to be fair to your peers. And but let's talk about other things, Joe. Let's talk about what else we can do as a homeowner or as a service tech to extend the life of the little bit of chlorine we have. What comes to mind first for you?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of things. Obviously, secondary oxidation. So you see, the systems that you can add on or that are in place in some pools, like ozone or UV, which is not oxidation but additional sanitation. And just using some non-chlorine shock when you don't need to escalate the chlorine level. So something like a potassium peroxymonopersulfate.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so those are supplemental things to chlorine. There's other secondary systems. There's AOP. There's hyperdissolved oxygen, which is pretty recent, but it's pretty badass too. It's just a lot of purified oxygen injected into the water to accelerate the rate of oxidation from the chlorine that you have. It's not a sanitizer or anything, but it really makes your chemicals a lot more efficient. It certainly makes our enzymes a lot more efficient. We've seen that. But you could supplement in those ways. Now, one thing I will say about UV, I like UV a lot. Just be aware that UV breaks down chlorine. So if you don't have that CYA in your pool, or not a lot of it, don't worry, I'm not advocating for a lot of CYA. We'll get to that in a moment. But if you don't have it, UV is going to break down chlorine that you have. So it's like a concentrated vessel of sunlight. That's what it does. But if there's sunscreen in the water, it's actually going to block a lot of that UV, and it's not going to make it quite as effective. And my apologies to any UV manufacturers out there. I still love the system. It's just something that pool owners and operators need to be aware of. It will help, but it's not going to necessarily help prolong the life of chlorine indefinitely. It's not like ozone, which is firing on all cylinders and oxidizing and killing just about everything. But that's my opinion. That's Eric's opinion. I shouldn't say that's Orenda's opinion. That's Eric's opinion. And you got to keep in mind, I'm a swimmer, so I come from the perspective of being in the water. I've been in these systems. I guess I should say I've been in pools with these systems, and I know what the water feels like in different situations. But what about deliberately slowing down chlorine, Joe? I mean, if we're trying to extend it for a week, we're trying to make sure we have chlorine for the week. We're going to say something pretty taboo here, but it's intentional. What can we do to deliberately slow down chlorine and extend its life during the week?
Well, it's a balancing act, but you talk about how much cyanuric acid is too much, right? So getting enough in there that you're getting the maximum benefit from it, just not putting too much in that you're overdoing it and
That's
needing
right.
more chlorine.
Yeah, and so we go back to, I think it was episode 24 when we covered Pillar 4. Keep your CYA as low as possible, ideally between 30 and 50 parts per million or less, but just don't go over 50. Now, this is kind of unconventional, uncertain times that we're in. And I don't want to be taken out of context here, but if you are not able to hold chlorine during the week, you can take a calculated risk and raise your CYA above 50 in the short term. You can do that. I don't recommend doing that when the water gets colder, but if you need that final push to get to the end of the season, you can do that. But there's a big caveat here, Joe. If you're going to slow down your chlorine on purpose so that you have some, you are going to want to also supplement with something like a phosphate remover. Or if you have secondary oxidation, that's fine too. Like if you have an ozone or AOP system, you should be okay. So one thing that you could do, Joe, for example, is instead of having 50, maybe go up to 60 parts per million CYA. But in that case, or even 70, but in that case, you should also handle oxidant demand, do anything you can to take other things out of the equation. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Instead of using chlorine for everything, like so many people have done for so many years, oh, we got a problem, throw more chlorine at it. Oh, we have to shock now because we need breakpoint chlorination. We've got a lot of combined chlorine, throw more chlorine at it. Oh, our pool's getting cloudy, throw more chlorine at it. Well, if you're not diagnosing what's causing these issues, is chlorine always the answer? Joe, do you think it's always the answer?
Definitely not.
Nope. But yet that's been the conventional wisdom for so long. So instead, we want to diagnose what these problems actually are, and we want to get ahead of them. So if you're going to raise your CYA, you can do it in a controlled way, but you're going to want to handle your phosphates and other oxidants. You can use the enzymes. Of course, this is our podcast. We don't want this podcast to be about our products, but if you have never purged your pool with CV600 or CV700 enzymes, you are missing out. This is why Orenda has gotten so popular, is the Orenda purge, or some people call it the Orenda bomb. When you clean out all the crud in that water, all the non-living crud, I should say, organics, bather waste, sunscreen, lotions, all that stuff, you really clear the path for chlorine to be more efficient. If you've never done it, you may think you have clean water. Just wait. Wait till you see what your water can look like after a CV600 or CV700 enzyme purge. And again, it's not a commercial for it, but it does take a lot of demand off of your chlorine, so chlorine can last longer in your pool. Finally, I want to talk about nitrogen compounds and other oxidants that you may not realize you're adding to your pool. Now, if you have combined chlorine at all, I've had several calls in the last couple of weeks from customers that just cannot figure out where the combined chlorine is coming from. And of course, I'm telling them on the phone, it's nitrogen coming from somewhere. Usually, it's usually ammonia or urea, which converts into ammonia. But if you have combined chlorine, you have some form of ammonia in your water. Where did it come from? Now, Joe, you have a lot of experience in this side of chemistry. When you're measuring for combined chlorine, tell the audience, what is combined chlorine? I mean, we'll do a whole episode on it, but just a breakdown of what are we actually measuring?
Yeah, so, while free chlorine is the killing free available form of chlorine, combined chlorine is the chlorine that's been basically used up. Once it's used up, now it's pretty much useless. It has very little sanitizing ability, and then you want to get rid of it, and you always want to have enough free that you're getting rid of that combined chlorine, breakpoint chlorination.
Right. And Joe said something very important there. It does have some sanitizer ability, which is why it shows up on a total chlorine test. But total chlorine minus free chlorine, that distance? It's that difference between total chlorine and free chlorine is your combined chlorine. If you have any, that means that you have chlorine that has bound to ammonia or some nitrogen compound. Because instead of like a carbon chain organic waste that chlorine can just oxidize and break down over time, chlorine has to combine with nitrogen. And it's a different process of oxidation. It has to actually become one with it. And we have several articles on breakpoint chlorination and combined chlorine and all that on the Orenda website and in the Orenda app. And you can just read them in the articles section. But in order to reduce your combined chlorine, number one, you got to figure out where is it coming from. And normally there's two sources that dominate in the residential space. And then in the commercial space, that's a little bit different. But in the residential space, the two most common sources of ammonia, you want to guess one of them, Joe?
I'm going to guess cleaning products.
Yep. Specifically, algicide. Now, not all algicides contain ammonia, but there are a lot of ammonia-based algicides. Quaternary ammonia is a quat algicide. There's ammonium, I believe ammonium sulfate, dimethyl ammonium chloride. There's also anything that contains the word ammonia or ammonium in it is going to be a nitrogen-based cleaner. And by the way, they kill germs. They're awesome. They're EPA registered. I mean, they absolutely do. And in the commercial space, deck cleaners are often ammonia-based. And if that gets into the gutter or it gets into the water, oh my God, you're going to have a combined chlorine issue. We're going to do a whole nother episode on combined chlorine. But you gotta stop it at the source. If it's a cleaning product, get it away from your pool. You do not want any ammonia getting in there. Of course, the secondary way is fertilizers in an outdoor pool. If you're near a golf course or irrigation and any of that stuff blows into your water, or if you're just doing landscaping and some fertilizer gets blown in from the rain or whatever, or actually literally a customer we were speaking to 2 weeks ago, he had a fertilizer sprinkler that he was walking through his yard with, and it just threw some into the pool. And he's wondering, how do I have so much combined chlorine? So I told him this. He's like, oh, crap. Now I know what happened, right? So keep the ammonia out of your water the best you can. If you're using algicides, I would normally try to be politically correct and say, oh, no, I don't want to pick on algicides. Yeah, forget that. We're picking on algicides today, Joe. Every type of algicide except for free chlorine has some sort of byproduct, and almost every one of those byproducts will eventually conflict with chlorine. whether it's an ammonia based, because now you got to go through the breakpoint chlorination curve, you got to combine with it. It takes a lot of free chlorine to get rid of that ammonia. Or it's copper sulfate. Copper is going to get oxidized eventually, and you're going to be left with sulfates, which is something we're going to talk about in our next episode, 31. Sodium bromide becomes bromates. Now you've got bromine in your water, and that conflicts with chlorine. Everything has a longer term consequence after the initial kill. All of them will kill. They're all good products in the short term, but Joe, you know this as well as anyone. Long term, you're actually going to use up a lot of chlorine trying to get rid of the byproducts of these algicides. Is that your experience too?
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And you're using one product, but eventually the other product's going to have to get rid of it. So, there's a better way during this chlorine shortage.
For sure. And I know it's tempting because, I don't want algae. I better put in, an algicide. Okay, yeah, pump the brakes. Yeah, I don't disagree. Like, you got to handle that. But is that the most effective way to get rid of it? That's for you to decide. The final thing of getting ammonia in your water is people peeing in the pool. I mean, a little bit in our sweat too, but people peeing in the pool or dogs peeing in the pool or dead cicadas or, basically animals can also introduce nitrogen into the water. So try to minimize that as much as you can. Keep your pool clean, net the leaves out, get that stuff out. And you're going to have less demand on your chlorine, and hopefully that'll allow you to extend the life of it. I think I've covered the notes that I have here, Joe, on how we can extend the life of chlorine. Should we recap it and then call it a day?
I think that sounds about right. Yeah.
Okay. So number one, you can raise your CYA in a controlled way as long as you are also supplementing chlorine to handle the consequences of that slower chlorine. Okay. It's all about the free chlorine to cyanuric acid ratio. All right. It's not about chasing pH anymore. It's not about all that stuff. You've got CYA in your water. Chlorine will pretty much instantaneously bind to CYA in your water. But before it gets into the water, if it's a sunny day, you want to pour that liquid chlorine in the shade, okay, or at night. You don't want direct sunlight because even from the bottle to the water, direct sunlight can break down that liquid chlorine, right? So that right there is going to help you a lot. Now, if you are able to do it at night, you're a homeowner, chlorinate at night. Give yourself time. That's going to help out a lot. And then other than the CYA, I think just supplement chlorine either with a secondary system or with enzymes, phosphate remover, things like that. But that's for you. Feel free to do your own research. Of course, we are incredibly biased, being that we are Orenda and we make phosphate remover and enzymes. So take that with a grain of salt. We're not hiding that fact, but it's up to you on how you want to handle the oxidant demand in your water. Chlorine may not be able to do it all. That's just some food for thought. Joe, anything else before we go?
No, I guess, we're really talking about just being a little bit more vigilant during this time of shortage. And if you work a little harder at it, you can save money, time, effort, doing it the right way. And, part of that is making your chlorine more efficient. So, I think this is really a learning season, a chance for people to do it a little bit better and ultimately down the road, be a better pool manager. So, try something different right now. Try to maximize your chlorine efficiency because it will really help as you go into years when chlorine is more readily available because it's going to save you money and time down the road.
Right. Absolutely. Well, I'm Eric Knight, and this has been Joe Swayze with me. Joe, thanks again for being on this. This has been episode 30 of the Rule Your Pool podcast. In the next episode, which we're about to film right now, Joe, same day, 1 week apart, who cares? Okay. And we're going to talk about acid because now we have an acid shortage, and we're going to talk about alternatives. So stay tuned for that next week. Thank you so much for your time, everyone.
Thank you for listening to Rule Your Pool, a podcast by Orenda Technologies. For more information on what we discussed in this week's episode, check the links in the description or visit www.orendatech.com.
I hope you find this show valuable enough that you tap that subscribe button and share it with your friends. You can also like us on Facebook and social media. And with our help, you'll be able to rule your pool without over-treating it with chemicals and wasting money. I'll see you next episode.